CHAPTER V. Of a Phantom Lover, by Vernon Lee. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The following days, Mrs. Oke was in a condition of quite unusual good spirits. Some visitors, distant relatives, were expected, and although she had expressed the utmost annoyance at the idea of their coming, she was now seized with a fit of housekeeping activity, and was perpetually about arranging things and giving orders, although all arrangements, as usual, had been made, and all orders given by her husband. William Oke was quite radiant. "If only Alice were always well like this," he exclaimed. "If only she would take, or could take, an interest in life, how different things would be! But," he added, as if fearful lest he should be supposed to accuse her in any way, "how can she usually with her wretched health? Still, it does make me awfully happy to see her like this." I nodded, but I cannot say that I really acquiesced in his views. It seemed to me, particularly with the recollection of yesterday's extraordinary scene, that Mrs. Oke's high spirits were anything but normal. There was something in her unusual activity and still more unusual cheerfulness that was merely nervous and feverish, and I had the whole day the impression of dealing with a woman who was ill and who would very speedily collapse. Mrs. Oke spent her day wandering from one room to another, and from the garden to the greenhouse, seeing whether all were in order, when, as a matter of fact, all was always in order at Okehurst. She did not give me any sitting, and not a word was spoken about Alice Oke or Christopher Lovelock. Indeed, to a casual observer, it might seem as if all that craze about Lovelock had completely departed, or never existed. About 5 o'clock, as I was strolling among the red brick, round gabled outhouses, each with its armorial oak, and the old fashioned spaliered kitchen and fruit garden, I saw Mrs. Oke standing, her hands full of York and Lancaster roses, upon the steps facing the stables. A groom was currycombing a horse, and outside the coach house was Mr. Oke's little high-wheeled cart. "Let us have a drive," suddenly exclaimed Mrs. Oke on seeing me. "Look, what a beautiful evening, and look at that dear little cart. It is so long since I've driven, and I feel as if I must drive again. Come with me, and you, harness Jim at once and come round to the door." I was quite amazed, and still more so when the cart drove up before the door and Mrs. Oke called me to accompany her. She sent away the groom, and in a minute we were rolling along at a tremendous pace, along the yellow sand road with the sere pasture lands, the big oaks on either side. I could scarcely believe my senses. This woman, in her mannish little coat and hat, driving a powerful young horse with the utmost skill, and chattering like a schoolgirl of 16, could not be the delicate, morbid, exotic hothouse creature, unable to walk or to do anything, who spent her days lying about on couches in the heavy atmosphere, redolent with strange scents and associations, of the yellow drawing-room. The movement of the light carriage, the cool draught, the very grind of the wheels upon the gravel, seemed to go to her head like wine. "It is so long since I have done this sort of thing," she kept repeating. "So long, so long. Oh, don't you think it delightful, going at this pace, with the idea that at any moment the horse may come down, and we too be killed?" And she laughed her childish laugh, and turned her face, no longer pale, but flushed with the movement and the excitement, towards me. The cart rolled on quicker and quicker, one gate after another swinging to behind us, as we flew up and down the little hills, across the pasture lands, through the little red brick gabled villages, where the people came out to see us pass, past the rows of willows along the streams, and the dark green, compact hop fields, with the blue and hazy tree tops of the horizon getting bluer and more hazy as the yellow light began to graze the ground. At last we got to an open space, a high lying piece of common land, such as is rare in that ruthlessly utilized country of grazing grounds and hop gardens. Among the low hills of the Weald it seemed quite preternaturally high up, giving a sense that its extent of flat heather and gorse, bound by distant firs, was really on the top of the world. The sun was setting just opposite, and its lights lay flat on the ground, staining it with the red and black of the heather, or rather turning it into the surface of a purple sea, canopied over by a bank of dark purple clouds, the jet-like sparkle of the dry ling and gorse tipping the purple like sunlit wavelets. A cold wind swept in our faces. "What is the name of this place?" I asked. It was the only bit of impressive scenery that I had met in the neighborhood of Okehurst. "It is called Cotes Common," answered Mrs. Oke, who had slackened the pace of the horse and let the reins hang loose about his neck. "It was here that Christopher Lovelock was killed." There was a moment's pause, and then she proceeded, tickling the flies from the horse's ears with the end of her whip, and looking straight into the sunset, which now rolled a deep purple stream across the heath to our feet. "Lovelock was riding home one summer evening from Appledore, when, as he got halfway across Cotes Common, somewhere about here, for I've always heard them mention the pond and the old gravel pits as about the place, he saw two men riding towards him, in whom he presently recognized Nicholas Oke of Okehurst, accompanied by a groom. Oke of Okehurst hailed him, and Lovelock rode up to meet him. "I am glad to have met you, Mr. Lovelock," said Nicholas, "because I have some important news for you." And so saying, he brought his horse close to the one that Lovelock was riding, and suddenly turning round, fired off a pistol at his head. Lovelock had time to move, and the bullet, instead of striking him, went straight into the head of his horse, which fell beneath him. Lovelock, however, had fallen in such a way as to be able to extricate himself easily from his horse, and, drawing his sword, he rushed upon Oke and seized his horse by the bridle. Oke quickly jumped off and drew his sword, and in a minute Lovelock, who was much the better swordsman of the two, was having the better of him. Lovelock had completely disarmed him, and got his sword upon Oke's neck, crying out to him that if he would ask forgiveness he should be spared for the sake of their old friendship, when the groom suddenly rose up from behind and shot Lovelock through the back. Lovelock fell, and Oke immediately tried to finish him with his sword, while the groom drew up and held the bridle of Oke's horse. At that moment the sunlight fell upon the groom's face, and Lovelock recognized Mrs. Oke. He cried out, "Alice! Alice, it is you who have murdered me," and died. Then Nicholas Oke sprang into his saddle and rode off with his wife, leaving Lovelock dead by the side of his fallen horse. Nicholas Oke had taken the precaution of removing Lovelock's purse and throwing it into the pond, so the murder was put down to certain highwaymen who were about in that part of the country. Alice Oke died many years afterwards, quite an old woman, in the reign of Charles II. But Nicholas did not live very long, and shortly before his death got into a very strange condition, always brooding, and sometimes threatening to kill his wife. They say that in one of these fits, just shortly before his death, he told the whole story of the murder, and made a prophecy that when the head of his house and master of Okehurst should marry another Alice Oke, descended from himself and his wife, there should be an end of the Okes of Okehurst. You see, it seems to be coming true. We have no children, and I don't suppose we shall ever have any. I, at least, have never wished for them. Mrs. Oke paused, and turned her face towards me with the absent smile in her thin cheeks. Her eyes no longer had the distant look; they were strangely eager and fixed. I did not know what to answer. This woman positively frightened me. We remained for a moment in that same place, with the sunlight dying away in crimson ripples on the heather, gilding the yellow banks, the black waters of the pond, surrounded by thin rushes and the gravel pits, while the wind blew in our faces and bent the ragged, warped, bluish tops of the firs. Then Mrs. Oke touched the horse, and we went off at a furious pace. We did not exchange a single word, I think, on the way home. Mrs. Oke sat with her eyes fixed on the reins, breaking the silence now and then only by a word to the horse, urging him to an even more furious pace. The people we met along the roads must have thought that the horse was running away, unless they noticed Mrs. Oke's calm manner and the look of excited enjoyment in her face. To me it seemed that I was in the hands of a mad woman, and I quietly prepared myself for being upset or dashed against a cart. It had turned cold, and the draught was icy in our faces when we got within sight of the red gables and high chimney stacks of Okehurst. Mr. Oke was standing before the door. On our approach I saw a look of relieved suspense, of keen pleasure, come into his face. He lifted his wife out of the cart in his strong arms with a kind of chivalrous tenderness. "I am so glad to have you back, darling," he exclaimed. "So glad. I was delighted to hear you had gone out with the cart, but as you have not driven for so long, I was beginning to be frightfully anxious, dearest. Where have you been all this time?" Mrs. Oke had quickly extricated herself from her husband, who had remained holding her, as one might hold a delicate child who has been causing anxiety. The gentleness and affectation of the poor fellow had evidently not touched her; she seemed almost to recoil from it. "I have taken him to Cotes Common," she said, with that perverse look which I had noticed before, as she pulled off her driving gloves. "It is such a splendid old place." Mr. Oke flushed as if he had bitten upon a bad tooth, and the double gash painted itself scarlet between his eyebrows. Outside, the mists were beginning to rise, veiling the parkland dotted with big black oaks, and from which, in the watery moonlight, rose on all sides the eerie little cry of the lambs separated from their mothers. It was damp and cold, and I shivered. End of chapter 5.